For our last session about the artist's voice, I have the great pleasure of introducing our next speaker, the artist David Reed, a self-described Californian who lives and works in New York since 1971. David's abstract paintings have developed over the years through different bodies of work, from early landscape paintings to more conceptual and process-based works, such as his door and brushstroke paintings from the 70s. Since the early 80s, he has been thinking about film color and how it can be experienced in the paintings. Most recently, he has been experimenting with the reproduction of earlier brush marks through many layered laser-cut stencils of scanned brush marks from earlier paintings. In the past, we have had several opportunities to work with David, and I really admire his reflective way of thinking about the process of painting and paint techniques, as well as his deep curiosity of art itself. His acclaimed exhibition last year at the New York's Gagosian Gallery that was curated by Christopher Wool and Kate Siegel brought together many paintings that David had made more than 40 years ago. Today he will give us an example of how an artist strives to maintain the physical legacy and how he deals with the aging of his work. This and more thoughts on the attempt to revisit the working process of these earlier paintings will be addressed in today's talk, Repainting Paintings. Please help me welcome David Reed.
Thank you, Christine. And I'd like to begin by thanking Christian. Look what you got me into, Christian. I'm in big trouble up here. Okay, but I'll try. Let's see what I could do. I've learned a lot from this experience. And I'd also like to thank everyone in your studio. They've been very helpful and kind. And I'd like to thank the previous speakers. I haven't been here for everything, but I've learned a lot from what I've heard. It's been very thought-provoking and inspiring. And I want to mention something that Jeffrey Weiss said yesterday on a panel. And I wrote it down, Carol Lee, so we'll have it. He said, artists are more or less allowed by us to do whatever they want to do. That's great. And maybe I should talk to him about what he means by more or less. And I'm especially honored to be here with Carol Lee Schneemann and to be talking with her today. Thank you. And I want to emphasize that I can only speak for myself and from my own experiences. All artists have very different points of view about these issues. Some artists don't care if their work lasts a long time. I'm on the other side of this spectrum. I care about it lasting. I think that's one reason I became an artist. But I learn a lot from other attitudes as well as my own. There was a lot of talk of the minimalist generation earlier, and then just the last speakers today, we heard about Felix Gonzalez-Torres. And I really enjoyed hearing about him and his thoughts about his work and how it progressed. I learned a lot. And I knew him slightly, and I want to tell a little story. It's something I've thought about a lot. He told me when he first came to New York as a job, he worked installing other shows. And often the painters were very difficult and persnickety about how their works were installed. Once they were with a painter who complained that the show was too high, big paintings, difficult to hang, and he told the installers to bring them all down 1 inch. Felix said, we told him to go get a cup of coffee, come back, we do it. They didn't touch anything. He came back and looked and said, it looks fantastic. Big improvement, thanks a lot. And Felix looked at me and said, David, don't be a 1 inch man. So I think why Christian invited me was because of the show Christine mentioned. Recently, paintings of mine made in 1975 were in a show curated by Katie Siegel, who's here today, and Christopher Wool. Is that you, Katie? Hi, thank you. And it was an amazing experience for me. I saw paintings that I hadn't seen for 40 years. And many issues came up, so I'm going to talk today about my experiences with that. Seeing the paintings again was intense and emotional. The original show at Susan Caldwell Gallery in Soho was a failure in practical terms and in commercial terms. There was a very positive review by Peter Sheldall in Art in America, but only one painting sold. Here are some more images of that show. Many colleagues saw the show, so I became part of a community of painters in New York because of it. And a young painter saw the show named Christopher Wool, who I didn't meet until quite a few years later. And he remembered the show, and that's why he wanted to be one of the curators of the show, and I'm very touched by that. After the show ended, I had to get a full-time job to support myself and my young son, with whom I shared joint custody. So this is a diagram I made in one of my notebooks about what happened to each of the paintings in the show. It turns out to be a very useful thing to have. If you notice, the star I put in ink, very important. That's the one painting that sold. I destroyed a number of them. Some were kept at the gallery, and some returned to my studio. In June of 2016, I met with Katie and Christopher, the conservators from the Guggenheim Museum, and others from venues for the show at the storage facility of the Guggenheim Museum. We came to see this painting, number 90, which we wanted to borrow for the show. It was very upsetting for me to see the painting again. It seemed it still had power, but it looked vulnerable and in need of help. I had to keep my emotions under control so I could think clearly. It's a large painting, the largest of all of them done at that time, and the paint is quite thick, so it is cracked a bit more than the others. And when I spoke to the conservators, there were many questions. Should the cracking between the separate canvases be repaired? You can see some of that on this slide, and I think there's, and maybe the slide going back. At the time I did these, my friends and other conservators said, you can't do this, the paint will crack off and fall out. But I decided I'd go ahead anyway, and I'm glad I did. It's not a problem. It sometimes cracks a bit, but it's clear what's going on. No problem. And then they had questions that things I'd never thought about. Should we repair the cracking in the black areas where it shows more? In the tan areas? And they asked me a lot of questions about the materials I'd used. And because I was in such an extreme emotional state at that moment, it was very hard for me to focus and reconstruct. My memories, I found, were imprecise and often mistaken. I thought these paintings had been done with alkyd paint. We found that it was oil. Alkyd wasn't used until 1976. Christian is nodding. He knew all of this already, but I didn't. So I learned the artist was wrong. I told him at the time it was alkyd, and then had to correspond back and admit I'd made a mistake. And I learned that the memories of artists are not always to be trusted. Again, Christian is nodding. Yeah, I like it. Okay. We also brought together another 3 paintings for viewing while considering our plans for the show. And I saw them laid out on a table like this. I think Christian came up with me and saw them also. And they seemed to me to look like sick patients, perhaps in a spa of some kind. Yeah. And they looked happy to be there. They knew they were going to get care. And maybe here we have Albert Olin coming for a visit. Very nice. And one of the paintings that came back was the painting in the foreground, number 50, which I had not seen since it had been in the show. And I didn't have good records of who bought it and what had happened to it. I thought I would never see that painting again. And it was a very special one to me. So I was amazed to see this photograph. In their research, they found this painting in a real estate ad in Westchester. And through that, and all I had was the name of the collector, we could track down the painting. It was in perfect condition, and we could borrow it for the show. And it's still within the same family, and they really appreciate it. It's a beautiful story. Here's the painting, number 50. And the first venue was the Rose Museum, and not knowing how I would react to seeing the paintings again, I went up the day before to go by myself and take a look. Christopher Wool, at the meeting at the Guggenheim Museum, had asked me if I had ever painted the paintings on separate canvases and then taken them apart. And I very confidently said no, that had never happened. And when I started looking at the Rose Museum, I started noticing the bolt holes in the side and realized that I was wrong, that this in fact was part of a series of canvases, and I had taken the others away and just kept this one. Again, the artist was not right. I was very interested in this painting, the second one over, the red painting, because it too had bolt holes, and I could tell from the side that it also had been part of a pair of canvases in this case, I think, and then separated. So this gave me a whole different way of carefully looking at these paintings and thinking about them and new possibilities for the future. And I took great pleasure in telling Christopher Wool he was correct. And I guess what I learned from this is sometimes artworks know more than the artist does. And one of the paintings that Christopher and Katie especially wanted in this show was number 36, which is in the center of the wall with the diagonals. I, over the years, had come to view this as an oddball painting. I was afraid that the diagonal marks were arbitrary and formal, and it wasn't one of my favorites. But they were especially interested, and I wanted to follow their interest, and I'm glad I did. There was another similar painting, number 58, which had been destroyed shipping it to New York from Chicago. But luckily, I had a good photograph. So I decided I would repaint 58, not knowing all I was getting myself into. I think Christian discouraged me. Katie and Christopher discouraged me. They thought it would never work. The painting could never be shown. But I was the artist, right? So I could do what I wanted. So I went ahead and to see what would happen. I thought they were probably right, but anyway, I wanted to go ahead, and I'm glad I did. It was easy and felt natural to make the brush marks. The flexible movements of my arm extending outward from my chest at different angles felt natural, and I realized what the painting was about is all the marks you can easily make with your right hand going outward from your body. So the marks aren't arbitrary, they relate very directly to the body, and this is something I didn't understand enough at that time, and I'm very glad I understand it more because it's going to affect my work. So this is the painting we had in the show. No, what am I saying? I think this is the painting from the photograph. Before was the painting in the show. This is the painting from the photograph. And these are my attempts at repainting it. The one on the right was no good at all. I tried to go over the second mark down and found that never worked. So this is the one I ended up keeping. We decided we couldn't put it in the show at the Rose. Here it is in the middle with the original 36 and other paintings in the show. And it does look different because of the materials. It's probably easier to see in person than in the image. So it couldn't be included in the show. That was clear. But we did decide that we could put it in the window in the front, in the display. And it's a painting I haven't signed, and I won't let out of the studio, but I have other plans for it, and I'll show you at the end what I'm thinking of. Oops, I blew my... So I feel very lucky to be able to look back again at my work. I had to investigate long-forgotten intentions, some consciously known at the time, and others intuitive, and still not completely understood. Some of the decision and impulses that I could identify seemed good, and I knew that they led in good directions for my painting. But other decisions and impulses were misguided. Some of these, I understand now, were due to mistakes in my thinking. I'm happy to talk in detail about that some other time. But some of them seem to me now to be related to limited resources and support. And it's very hard to sort through what's the cause of what. And it's important for me to try and do that, as difficult and painful as it is. One lifetime is barely enough time to make good art. 2 lifetimes would be better. More artists are now going through this kind of re-examination of their early work, and more of this will happen in the future. Artists are living longer, and reassessments of the past are speeding up. These developments will change what art is and what it can be. A few weeks ago, I went to the opening of a show of a friend of mine, Al Rupersberg, at the Walker Center. It was a retrospective of 50 years of work. So I'm just a beginner at this. I'm just beginning to learn. The main lesson I learned from seeing my paintings again was that when I made them, I acted on impulse very directly without caring about the result. I relied on intuitions, and this gave the paintings a sense that they have to be the way they are. They were done with a tremendous sense of impatience. Once Con Edison turned out my electricity, I was determined to paint. I ran extension cords from the hallway. They weren't quite long enough to reach into the studio, so I took a hammer and put a hole in the wall, ran the extension cord through so I could paint. So it's still there, that hole. And I'd like to keep that feeling in my current paintings. But how can this feeling that I want be combined with the complex reassessment that I'm going through about my work? Can these two feelings be combined? The image I keep having is of Penelope at night taking apart what she's woven during the day, and then of Ulysses acting with great wit and speed during the day. So this is some tries now to think about what's I can do with what I've been going through. And I don't know whether these will result in finished paintings or they're just another step on the way of discovering things. What's fun is because the image on the top is a stencil, I can wrap it around. And these are just mock-ups. You can see it's just a printout of what that brush mark looks like. So thank you very much. And I think, is it right, Christian, we have some questions?
There will be 10 questions.
Okay.
I had a question that you started to address a little bit about sort of the lack of premeditation in your earlier work, if I'm understanding correctly, and maybe that some of your newer work is more premeditated, or you maybe have a better sense now of what might happen?
I think I'd put it looks more premeditated now, but in fact it isn't. In a case like this where I put the stencil mark, I can decide to do it quickly, I can move it around right where I want it, and then when it goes on, it's done very precisely, but the way of thinking and the placement can all be very intuitive and direct. My paintings are a funny combination of those two qualities.
Yeah, I get that sense. And I was also interested to know if there was a role of perfectionism, sort of waning and waxing perfectionism that, you know, in the earlier work you may not have had, but that through your career and through more experience and wanting a very specific result, that perfectionism becomes a part of those decisions in the studio.
I'm afraid I have to plead guilty. It's true, and
I understand. I have the same problem.
and what I love working the way I do now is I can be very intuitive and very, what would you say, just go on my instincts when I'm putting down wet paint at the beginning, either making marks with a brush when the paintings are up vertically or with a knife when it's down horizontally. And I never know what I'm going to do exactly, and then I have that, and then I can look at it for a while and think about it, and then the way I'm working now, think about a stencil that would go someplace, and then we can print that out the size that I think will work, and if that's too small, print it out a little bigger, and then try that out, and then move it exactly where I want it to be. I can say to my assistants, go over half an inch to the right, or half an inch, or rotate it a few degrees. And it's an amazing thing for me to be able, sometimes I think I'm combining Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol in the same painting, and it's a wonderful way to be able to paint. So I'm enjoying it. And there certainly are times in that where I can be perfect, because it always aggravated me. I'd make a good mark, but it'd be 2 inches too far to the left. And now I don't have to do that.
Thank you.
And you've spoken about how this exhibition that looked to the past has made you revisit how you work in the present and future work.
Yes, yes. And I should mention that I didn't make that beautiful installation, either of them, at the Rose or Gagosian. Katie Siegel and Christopher Wool installed the paintings. And I had a certain style of installing those paintings that I learned from Marcia Tucker. I imitated the way she had installed them. And it's a very good way, but I think Katie and Christopher's way was even better. So I especially learned from the way they installed the paintings.
Which makes me wonder whether, because you spoke about, or you started by stating that, contrary to other artists that do not care about legacy, you do. You want to think about it and you want to engage with it.
Yes.
So is this experience of both revisiting the works yourself personally and seeing others express new scholarship through the hanging and study of the work, has it made you think about legacy in other ways where you want to go back to the bodies of work that may be in storage, or you may want to provide instructions as to how to care for certain pieces, or is not something that is of interest?
No, all of that's true, and I think I'm here at this conference or symposium partially to hear what other people are thinking about these things, and to think myself about different possibilities that I may not know about. I've found some of the comments that people are making extremely interesting and bringing up possibilities that I'd never thought of. For example, I love the idea of a cooperative estate with a number of artists and not just one. And I'd never thought of that idea. And a lot of other things that I can look into more after this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, so the next point will be an interview or a conversation between Anya and Carolee, and it will take a moment to set that up, and then the program continues.